Hello, welcome to Prejim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 44 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about the required field validator control in ASP.NET. In general, validation controls are used to ensure if the data entered by the user is valid. Microsoft ASP.NET Framework provides 6 built-in validation controls. These validation controls can be found in the Visual Studio Toolbox under Validation tab. You can see the validation controls here: compare, custom, range, regular expression, required field, and validation summary controls. In general, these validation controls can be used to perform both the client-side and server-side validation. Now, browsers understand only client scripts and HTML. In the past, to perform the client-side validation, developers themselves had to write the custom JavaScript. With validation controls in place, we don't have to do that anymore. All we have to do is drag and drop these validation controls on the web form, configure some of the required properties, and that's it. When the page renders, these validation controls are going to emit the required JavaScript, which is going to perform the client-side validation for us. But then keep in mind, these client-side scripts can spread viruses and cause security concerns, because of which users may disable JavaScript on their browsers, and if that happens, client-side validation is skipped. That's why it's always a good practice to perform the server-side validation irrespective of whether client-side validation is done or not. In this example, in a bit, we'll discuss about how to do both the client-side and server-side validation using these validation controls. As part of this example, we need to design a form where the user can enter his name and select his gender, and then a button to submit the form to the server for processing. So first, let's go ahead and design this web form. Just to save some time in typing, I have this HTML already typed in. So let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have a simple ASP.NET web application project. Let's go ahead and paste that copied HTML here. Okay, so if you look at the design, it's exactly what we have seen on the screen. There is a text here, name, and then a text box for the user to enter their name, and then text gender, a drop-down list which shows the genders. So here, if you look at the drop-down list, we have 3 items within the drop-down list. The first item is like a prompt for the user, select gender, and the value for that is -1. And the next item is male, value is male, and the final item is female, and the value is female. And then finally, we have this button control whose ID is set to button save and text is set to save. The width of the button is obviously 100 pixels there. And then finally, we have a label control, which is used to display the status if the data is properly saved to the database or if there are any validation errors. Okay, so that's a simple web form design there. So obviously, when I double click this button, the event handler for the button click gets generated, and that's when we want to save the data to the database. But before that, we want to perform the validation on the client side. Okay, and to do the validation on the client side, we can make use of the validation controls that ASP.NET Framework provides for us. Now, what we basically want to do is, I want to ensure both these fields are entered by the user before they try to submit this form. Okay, so to do that, we have a validator control, required field validator control. As the name suggests, this validator control ensures that the user has entered some data into the controls before he submits the form for processing. So let's see how to use that validator control. So let me flip to the source mode here, and then the first thing I want to validate is the name of the user. So to capture the name of the user, I have this text box, txt name. So let me drag and drop a validation control onto the web form, the required field validator control. And if you look at this validator control, just like any other standard ASP.NET control, it has got the ID, and runAt is equal to server attributes. Let's give this ID a meaningful name, required field validator name, because this is going to validate the name text box. And then obviously, error message is the message that we want to display when the control fails the validation. The message that I want to display here is name is required. Alright, and the next property that we want to configure, that's most important, is the control to validate property. This is the property which is going to tell the validation control, alright, this validation control, you have to validate this control or some other control. Now, we want to tell that to the validator control. How do we do that? Using control to validate property. Here we specify the ID of the control that we want to validate. In this case, the text box ID is txt name. So I'm going to take that ID and specify that as the value for the control to validate property of the required field validator control. That's it. So now save this, and if we run the project and if we try to submit the page without entering a name, then it's going to prompt the user to actually enter the name. So I click save, so name is required. I get that, and the web form is not submitted to the server for processing. All this validation at the moment is happening on the client side. And if you look at that message, that's in black color. So obviously if you want to change that, you can specify the fore color just like any other control. So fore color, let's say I want that to be red, and I do that there. Okay, that's good. Now we have another control that I want to validate. That's drop down list in this case. So let me drag and drop another control, or let's copy and paste this. So I want another required field validator control to validate the selection within the drop down list. So I have pasted that here, and this is going to validate the gender. So I'm going to call this required field gender, and then the error message gender is required, and fore color is going to be red, and the control to validate. And this is what is very important. So this validator control should validate the drop down list, and the ID of the drop down list is ddl gender. So pick up that ID and specify that as the value for control to validate property. That's it. Now let's go ahead and run this and try to submit the form without selecting the name and gender, and see if we get the validation error messages. Okay, I haven't entered the name and selected the gender. Click save. Look at that, name is required, but where is the error message for gender? It's not coming, and that's because we have the select gender item already selected in the drop down list. So the required field validator is thinking that, okay, there is a selection within the drop down list, which means the user has supplied a value, but we know that that is the initial value in the drop down list and not a value that the user has selected. Okay, so if that's the case, we need to specify that to the required field validator. And how do we do that? The required field validator has got a property called initial value, and you need to specify what is the initial value. So do you specify select gender or -1? We need to specify -1, because that's the drop down list selected value item. When select gender is selected, the value is -1, so we have to specify the value, which is -1 here. So now if I run and if I try to submit the form without selecting the gender, we get the error message as expected. Save. So name is required, gender is required as expected. Now the validation is happening on the client side without even submitting the form to the server for processing. Okay, and all this is done by the JavaScript that is emitted by these validation controls. Okay, now in general, these validation controls, for example, the control to validate is common to all validation controls. Similarly, error message is common to all validation controls. As far as required field validator control is concerned, the only property that is specific to this control is the initial value property. Okay, now there are other properties which are common to every other validation control. For example, there is a property called text. Okay, if I specify text as, for example, star here, look at what's going to happen if I flip the form to design mode. Now look at this, instead of the error message, it's using the text. So when I run this form and try to submit without providing a value for the gender, the text property is used. So the star is displayed here and not the error message. Now there are reasons why we use this error message and text properties. When we talk about validation summary control, we'll understand that. But for now, understand that when we specify both text and error message properties, then text property will be shown by the validation control by default. Okay, and there is another property called display. Again, we'll talk about that just in a bit in a later session, so don't worry about that property for the time being. Okay, now when I run this and then try to submit the form without providing the values for the required fields, obviously I get validation errors. Okay, but then remember, users can disable client-side validation by disabling JavaScript. So if it's Internet Explorer, I can go to Tools, Internet Options, and go to the Security tab, and then on Local Intranet, click on Custom Level, scroll all the way down, and somewhere at the bottom you should see something called scripting, and by default that's enabled. Click on the disable radio button, click OK, you'll get security warning, click yes, and click OK. Now the JavaScript is disabled on the browser. Okay, now before we do any processing, let's change the code here. So when I click save button, we want to save the data to the database. Now I'm not going to save the data to the database, but then we're going to just, when we know that when the user clicks this button and if the form is posted back to the server, we are going to save the data to the database. So we have this label status on the web form, this particular label. I want to display a message there, label status dot text is equal to data saved successfully. Okay, that's fine. So now if we run this, remember we have disabled JavaScript on the client browser window. Okay, so I haven't selected anything here. I click save button. Look at that. It is showing that message data saved successfully, and I still get my validation error even upon post back, on the server side. The server has detected these two fields are required, and they are not populated, so I get the error messages back. But then the code in the button click is also executed, meaning if we had ADO.NET code here to save the data to the database, it would have saved an empty field into the name column and select gender into the gender column, which would have been, we didn't expect that to happen. Okay, so how do we validate the page on the server side? I want to check, okay, did every validation control pass validation? If that's the case, only then save the data to the database. Otherwise, display a message, just like how it is showing here, display this message here, but don't save the data. So how do we determine that on the server side? All you have to do is use one property. There is a property called if page dot is a valid property. So this is a Boolean property which is going to return a true or false. This property will return true if all the validation controls has passed validation. Otherwise this property is going to return false. So if page dot is valid, we know that all the validation controls has passed validation, which means the user has provided the required data, and then it is safe to save data, in which case you write the ADO.NET code here to save data to the database. Otherwise, if the page is not valid, that means at least one of the validation controls has failed validation, in which case we want display a message to the user stating that data is not saved. So label status.text, we can say validation failed, data not saved. Okay, and then probably if you want to give some color, so label status.foreColor is equal to system.drawing.color.red. Okay, on the other hand, if it successfully saves, maybe I want green color or whatever. Okay, so now let's put a breakpoint here. Let's run this one and see what is this property going to return when we actually submit the page without entering at least one of the required fields. So let the form load. Okay, so we have the form loaded. Let me click the save button. So we hit that breakpoint there, and look at this, page.isValid, that returns false. And then if it returns false, it's going to come to the else block, and I press F5, and as you expect, validation failed, data not saved. Now client-side validation is not done now because the client has disabled the JavaScript. So the JavaScript will not run on the client browser, and the web page will be submitted to the server for processing. And in that case, on the server, we are still checking, okay, is the page valid? If yes, then submit the data. Otherwise, display this error message. Okay, now on the other hand, let's supply everything. For example, name, let's say Prajim, and let's say gender as male. And now I click save button. Look at that, page.isValid true. Okay, I press F5 and data saved successfully. So keep in mind, even if one validation control fails validation, look at that, this property is going to return false. If all the validation controls on the page passes validation, only then this page.isValid property is going to return true, in which case we want to save the data, otherwise we want to display a message to the user. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.